Good evening. I'm Roxana Marcoci, Senior Curator of Photography at the Museum of Modern Art and the museum's CMAP leader for Central and Eastern Europe. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with CMAP, it's an acronym for Contemporary and Modern Art Perspectives, which is a pan-institutional initiative here focused on the study of art histories outside the hegemonic models of Western canons. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to this evening's public program, organized in conjunction with the launching of a new publication, Art and Theory of Post-1989, Central and Eastern Europe, a Critical Anthology, the latest edition in our primary document series. I had the fortune of realizing this book with two friends and exceptional associates and co-editors, Anna Janevsky, Curator of Media and Performance Art, and Ksenia Nuril, former CMAP Fellow for Central and Eastern Europe. On behalf of the three of us, I extend a heartfelt thank you to Jay Levinson, Director, and Sarah Lukowski, Associate Director of MoMA's International Program, for their untiring support of this project from inception to completion. In fact, it was the leadership support of the International Council and the general support of the Renova group of companies, Claudia Quentin, and other donors that made this publication possible. I hope you will all have the interest to read the book, which takes the political changes between 1989 and 1991 as its starting point to look at the transformations that the dismantling of socialist states across Central and Eastern Europe had on artistic practices and critical theory of the last 30 years. Our idea was to put forward a volume that would offer a re-examining perspective built on a plurivocal collaboration with a number of scholars and artists, of which more in a moment. The book unfolds across 7 thematic chapters and comprises 75 primary and secondary documents, including newly commissioned texts and interviews with artists. Its cover distinguishes itself by a visual from a 2011 work by artist Alexandra Piric, If You Don't Want Us, We Want You, which, as you can see in this slide, turns an equestrian statue, that of a European monarch, erected in the center of Bucharest, into a horizontal choreography, a standalone monument into a collective social sculpture, an object into a live action aimed to activate history. It's an image that cuts across the fields of dance, performance art, visual arts, and the political Volkstheater tradition, and manifests the book's intent, meaning how new artistic generations, as well as those of the 60s and 70s new avant-garde, have been critically rewriting their own histories while simultaneously rethinking the significance of the socialist legacy on art today, at a time when a wave of depoliticizing amnesia seems to define the neoliberal contemporary. In making this book, Anna, Ksenia, and I have benefited from the insights of a remarkable group of advisors in conceptualizing the book's discursive structure. And you can see them in this series of method-oriented seminars that we conducted between 2015 and 2017. And this evening, we owe the pleasure of having two of the advisors with us as featured speakers, philosopher and cultural theorist Boris Budin, and Claire Bishop, professor in the PhD program in art history at the CUNY Graduate Center. The others include Katy Chukrov of the Russian State Universities of the Humanities, philosopher and media theorist Boris Groys, Clara Kemp-Welsh of the Courtauld Institute of Art, Natasha Petreshin-Bacheles of l'Internationale, and independent curator and founder of the art magazine Springerin, Georg Schulhammer. Each has provided an overarching essay for one of the thematic chapters in the book. Furthermore, a cross-disciplinary team of MoMA current and former colleagues, CMAP fellows, curators, librarians, and archivists have acted as inside consultants. Kim Connetty, Michelle Elligot, Megan Forbes, John Hendricks, Juliet Kinchin, Magdalena Moskalevich, David Platzker, Polina Pobosha, Christian Rathemeyer, and David Senior. They have contributed either a summary of the chapter's critical text or a new interview with artists and artist collectives. We are extremely thankful to each one of them. Finally, critical to the making of this anthology have been our monthly interchanges over the full past decade with an extensive network of artists and scholars engaged with this subject. And here, a double spread from the book shows the Zagreb-based curatorial collective What, How, and For Whom, one among our long-standing cultural interlocutors. A charting of this inter- and transnational network and its protagonists is included at the end of the book, offering a succinct history of CMAP Central and Eastern Europe's reciprocations. To conclude, this book's premise came from our own understanding and underlying of a number of questions on whether the promise of a non-Western history of art can be fulfilled, on how heterogeneous artistic practices positioned within their specific localities, sociopolitical constellations, and relational diversities could offer interpretative strategies of a region's common socialist heritage today, and finally, on to what extent the events of 1989 have shifted the status quo, leading to revised narratives and an expanded view of modernism no longer defined according to mainstream art historical blueprints. This evening's program will address such and other questions in the unfolding succession. A keynote lecture by Boris Budin will be followed by a roundtable discussion with Boris Budin, Claire Bishop, and Alexandra Piric that will be introduced by Ksenia Nuril and moderated by Anna Janevsky. The panel will then be followed by a lecture performance by the art collective Slavs and Tatars, whose projects span different disciplines, including exhibitions, books, and lectures devoted to issues of language and politics of an area east of the former Berlin Wall and west of the Great Wall of China, known as Eurasia. The program will conclude with a concise Q&A session between participants and you, the audience. You are all invited afterwards to a celebratory drink right outside of this auditorium, hopefully in the garden if it's not raining. And for those interested in acquiring the book, it is available right now and after this program for purchase. And without further ado, now please join me in welcoming Boris Budin.
Thank you, Roxana. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you to all the editorial team. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor for me, first, to have participated in this wonderful project, to have contributed to the book, and secondly, to be invited here to participate in this launching of the book now when the job is done and when its result will be presented to the public. I don't know whether books like to be celebrated as usually as is the case usually with their authors, but if books want to survive, they have to be taken seriously. It is even more important for this book because the people, cultures, and art this book deals with, they haven't been taken seriously. This not to be taken seriously is probably the main feature of the condition in which you see art and theory of post-1989 Central in Eastern Europe is about, of this historical condition. To recognize a historical condition, probably the best way is to look into the language it uses, to look into a specific jargon of the, in this case, so-called post-communist transition to democracy. This is terminus technicus, how political science and history, mainstream history, thinks of this historical condition. And some clever political scientists, they really analyzed the jargon of this post-communist transition, and then they found out that there is a certain a curious set of metaphors that is used to describe this condition. Let me mention a few. Education for democracy, classrooms of democracy, democratic exams, democracy that is growing and maturing, but which might still be in diapers, or making its first steps, or of course, suffering from children illnesses. This language of post-communism discloses a paradox that points at what is probably the greatest scandal of the recent history. Those who proved their political maturity in the so-called democratic revolutions of 89-90 have become thereafter, overnight, children. As we all know, the peoples of the Eastern Europe, in fact, succeeded in toppling totalitarian regimes in whose persistency and steadfastness the whole so-called free and democratic world had firmly believed until the very last moment. I'll give you one example. You know the name very well, Zbigniew Brzezinski, advisor to President Carter. But in fact, the personification of the anti-communist strategy of the Cold War. In fact, the notion post-communism was coined by Zbigniew Brzezinski early in 89, actually few months before the Berlin Wall fell down. What meant post-communism for Brzezinski? Actually, he believed that the communists at that time have finally found the way, the form of their survival in taking ironic distance towards the ideology and ideals of communism. And he coined it, as I'm saying, shortly before the communists collapsed. So even he, who was, as I'm repeating this, the scholar and the personification of certain knowledge on communism, he couldn't see in advance that this will happen. So, just to remind you, in the struggle against the communist threat, the West had mobilized all its political, ideological, and military forces, its greatest statesmen and generals, philosophers and scientists, propagandists and spies, without ever really frightening the totalitarian beast. Yet, despite that, it calls those who chased away this beast with their bare hands children. Only yesterday, those people got world history going again and helped it to walk upright again. Yet today, they themselves must learn their first steps. Only yesterday, they taught the world a history lesson in courage, political autonomy, and historical maturity. Yet today, they must assert themselves before their new self-declared masters as their obedient pupils. Only yesterday, they were the saving remedy for fatally ill societies. Today, they themselves suffer from children illnesses, which they must survive in order to become capable of living. What miracle happened overnight? What wizard turned these people into children? This is my question for the historical, for the mainstream of historical, of the knowledge of history we have. Of course, who turned them to children? It was politics. The human being as a political child offers itself as the almost perfect subject of a democratic restart. Untroubled by the past and geared totally to the future, it is full of energy and imagination, compliant and teachable. It emanates freedom as though it's pure embodiment, but actually it is not free at all. A child is dependent. It must be guided and patronized by adults. However, this only makes it all the more suitable for serving society as the perfect ground for a new beginning. It neutralizes all the contradictions that the sudden eruption of freedom lays bare in society, above all between those who rule and the ruled. There is no relation of domination that seems so natural and self-evident as the one between a child and its guardian. No mastery is so innocent and justifiable as that over children. One does not take their freedom away, but suspends it temporarily, postpones it, so to speak, for the time being. A patronized child, as political being, enjoys a sort of delayed freedom. And in case one day the promise of freedom turns out to be a delusion, one can always say that it was just a children's fairy tale. The repressive infantilization of the societies that have liberated themselves from communism is the key feature of the so-called post-communist condition. In fact, this tension between maturity and immaturity is a quite long story. Or to put it more concretely, it is an invention of enlightenment. Indeed, enlightenment is nothing. I just remind you of Kant's famous essay on enlightenment from 1784. So enlightenment is for him nothing but a transition from immaturity to maturity, or in Kant's words, this is the first sentence, of man's emergence from his self-imposed immaturity, which he defines as the inability to use one's understanding without guidance from another. In historical development after Kant, the Enlightenment ideal of maturity was replaced by the concept of emancipation as an act of liberation from an unjustly imposed domination. The goal of emancipation was not anymore a mature individual, but rather a society free of domination. However, after 1945, after the victory over fascism, the concept of maturity reoccurred. This was also the time of a historic transition from fascist totalitarianism to democracy, especially in Western Europe. The traumatic historical experience of the masses, which had blindly followed their Führers into the catastrophe, made the idea of autonomous, mature, and responsible individuals attractive again. The education for maturity and responsibility was now recognized as a precondition for democracy. And it is believed that it is actually quite successful. You know, even today in Germany, there is a common belief that Germans are immune from fascism, from a possible return of fascism. There is a nice video by Alexander Kluge when he repeatedly asks this question to Germans, but are you sure? Are you immune from fascism? However, this education for maturity and responsibility, if it is propagated in the interest for domination and thereby turns into an endless process about whose possible conclusion the educators alone decide, then the call for maturity and responsibility no longer serves, as Robert Spemann writes, to enlarge the circle of the mature, but rather the circle of those who are for now declared immature. Thus, the child metaphors that are so typical of the jargon of the post-communist transition turn out to be a symptom of a new power relationship. This is best expressed in the fact that the child of post-communism always appears as culturally localized. Moreover, it is nothing but a figure of a cultural location. In fact, the whole historical event called the democratic revolution of 89-90, or more descriptively, the fall of communism, has been culturally localized. More precisely, it was Easternized. Not only did it happen in the East, it happened because of the East. At stake is no less than the historical meaning of the whole event. Already in 1990, German philosopher, famous liberal philosopher, Jürgen Habermas, defined the democratic revolution of 89-90 as the so-called, as the nachholende Revolution, which is a catching up revolution. The idea is that the toppling of the communist regimes in Eastern Europe made it possible for the people in Eastern Europe to catch up with the missed modernist development that was obstructed by the communist rule, blocked for decades. This is what the so-called democratic revolution of 89-90 is supposed to be about. It should have enabled the East to finally catch up with the missed modernist development, defining retroactively the whole space of the post-communism as the space of a belated modernism. Of course, the modernity that is meant here is a Western modernity, what curiously doesn't make it culturally particular. Quite the contrary. Western modernity appears as universal, the modernity as such. On the other side, the notion of East doesn't imply universal values. Moreover, it implies no values at all, for its meaning is defined exclusively through its relation to the West. In short, the East is belated. It means not yet the West. It is at stake is a cultural distance in time that defines this condition, a form in which the former Cold War divide has survived the collapse of communism in the trope of a chronically belated, underdeveloped, backward East. According to Slovenian philosopher Rastko Močnik, the West-East divide has survived the collapse of communism primarily due to its ideological function, which is to rob both sides, the West and the East, of their history. The West appears nowadays as emancipated not only from its own history, but moreover from any history. This is why it can be imposed and as general and canonic. The notion of East, on the contrary, functions as amnesia, whose purpose is to get rid of history and to become an ahistorical non-space as the West. Its own history is what makes the East peripheral and provincial. It thus has a history, but a history, as Močnik says, writes, would be better forgotten. It is not difficult to demonstrate how this frozen cultural difference between West and East generates historical oblivion and is, at the same time, perpetuated by this same oblivion. But why am I insisting here so much on the contradictions of the post-communist condition? Haven't we somehow learned to live with them in a sort of peaceful coexistence, as a normality? No. The reason for this points at something much worse. I'm talking about the contradictions of the post-communism and about this whole historical condition from a retrospective. In other words, I'm talking about our past. Indeed, the times have changed again. The history has moved one more time. while this book deals with the world, or at least a part of the world, after the so-called collapse of communism, it is being published and presented to you now in a new historical condition. In fact, we are gathering here to discuss the art and theory in Central and Eastern Europe after the collapse, not of communism, but of post-communism. This also means that the so-called process of the post-communist transition to democracy in the region we call here Central and Eastern Europe has failed. I'm not going to talk so much about it, to describe what is happening now, for instance, in Central Europe, about concepts of illiberal democracy, about pro-fascist movements, about right-wing conservative politics that was not seen since the 30s. Central Europe today is the name for a new condition. We don't have the name. We might call it neo-fascism, post-fascism. But what is interesting, beyond the divide between former East and the West, something new is happening there. So I'm not going to describe it. I think you know enough about it. Instead, I will only quote the title of my contribution in the book, which is Democracy in Eastern Europe, Old, Ugly, and Alone. If this is true, we should no longer play innocent. Even this book shouldn't play innocent either. It uses paradigms of cultural reflection and modes of cultural mapping that are not free of interests of domination and exploitation. What we have here is, to put it very simple, a production of certain knowledge on a particular geopolitically and culturally clearly demarcated area. First, what comes to our mind here is, of course, the case of the so-called area studies. But this is not my point. At stake is, however, a much older issue, an issue that has had much deeper epistemological and, what is more important here, social consequences. Concretely, at stake is a curious relation between the idea of a world divided into different areas or regions and the idea of different areas of our knowledge, or more precisely, the disciplinary division of humanist knowledge. Both emerged in the wake of colonial imperial modernity, concretely in the 17th century, which is crucial for our world, not only because of the peace treaty of Westphalia that created this world of the cluster of sovereign, secular nation states allegedly equal. Now they are gathering again here in New York. But the very idea of a disciplinary division of knowledge. This is this famous polemic between Boyle and Hobbes, when Boyle comes with the idea that knowledge should be organized, production of knowledge, within a community of peers who would agree on facts and agree on a common object of knowledge that was supposed to be outside, in the nature, in another culture. Hobbes, on the contrary, believed that there cannot be any knowledge without interests, that the interests are always within. But as we know, the disciplinary division of knowledge is, until nowadays, the way we produce knowledge. So this was, as I said, time when the old continent, already deeply traumatized by the religious wars, is suddenly challenged by a new complexity of human experience. It does not only react in creating the perception of an anthropological other, in the new colonies, introducing what will be later known as a difference between civilized and non-civilized part of the humanity. It also constructs, as I said, epistemological subjects and objects, a disciplinary community of peers expected to produce an objective knowledge, and its object somewhere outside in the nature or in other culture. This division has survived until nowadays, and we find it even institutionalized in our post-colonial era. For instance, in the opposition between Western theory and local cultural reality. But what in fact makes these both divisions politically relevant, besides the fact that they are at the core of what we call ethnocentrism and logocentrism, is their common relation to commodification of labor. The capture of labor for extraction of wealth and the accumulation of surplus value as a defining characteristic of modernity. It is better known as primitive accumulation. It's Marx's concept, and can be fully applied to the process of the so-called post-communist transition. We don't speak enough about this hidden process behind these cultural transformations. This is where and how the connection between Western theory and local cultural reality loses its innocence. And this is why we who produced this book should not play innocent either. But nevertheless, this book contains at the same time both awareness of this condition and an already articulated critique of it. If you like, this book is neither made by children nor made for children. This is why it cannot be innocent. Hegel, in the Phenomenology of Spirit, wrote that only a stone is innocent, adding, not even a child. Innocence is for him what he writes in German, reines Nichttun, a pure non-activity. It's pure not doing anything. This is why he uses the metaphor of a stone. Although it looks like a thing, this book, and have a weight almost of a small stone, this book is too human a thing. So it can, and it also should move, be active. Move forward our understanding of the historical condition in which we live, move forward both our cultural and artistic production, as well as the way we think of it, the way we reflect upon, for instance, historicity of art, or about art in history, or about art history as a discipline, or about its social and political meaning. So it should not leave us moving, I'm saying. It should not leave us indifferent towards the historical, political, and cultural changes it has witnessed and is talking about. That is, it shall move us to change too. For instance, to move us emotionally away from being indolent towards our historical and political reality, even if we don't get directly involved in it. To mention Kant again, his famous argument about French Revolution in his essay, The Conflict of the Faculties, his point is that the truth of a historical event doesn't lay in the doings, in the deeds of the perpetrators, of those who are actively involved in the event, but rather by the passive onlookers, but only if they enthusiastically identify with the progressive character of the event, with this move of the world towards the better. Only in this that case, this event will acquire a historical meaning and become itself a historical event. So let me conclude. Even if staying passive towards what is happening and around us today, this book can still move us enthusiastically welcome what is changing the world for the better, if anything is changing the world for the better today. This is no small thing. However, I still hope for more, that it can even move us to actively participate in these changes, which today has become necessary. Thank you.
Thank you, Boris, and thank you, everyone. I'm really glad you emphasized this idea of moving, because I think this book is, while it's come to an end, it's published, it's out here in the world circulating among us, it's very much the start of something else as well, the start of a conversation, the start of a debate. And I think it's wonderful that we'll now have a chance to open that up here. In researching this book, my co-editors and I aimed to represent a myriad of voices that speak to the heterogeneity of histories, cultures, and ideas within and stemming from the region. It's an honor and a pleasure to have some of those voices with us tonight to discuss the diverse contributions to this publication and begin and continue that conversation here. We have Alexandra Peric, an artist based in Bucharest, Romania, who practices across disciplines, engaging performance, sculpture, and technology in her work. Claire Bishop is professor in the PhD program in art history at the CUNY Graduate Center, and her current research interests include, but are not limited to, the impact of digital technologies on contemporary art and performance. She is currently a fellow in the dance division at the New York Public Library, where she's writing a history on Merce Cunningham's events. And Boris Budin, whom we just heard from, is a Croatian-born writer, cultural critic, and translator based in Berlin, who has published on the topics of photography, philosophy, politics, linguistics, and the post-communist condition. They're joined here tonight by Anna Yanevsky, who will moderate this discussion. Please join me in welcoming them to the stage.
Well, good evening, everyone, and it's really a great honor and a very special moment to present this book today, and we are very glad to do it with Claire, Alexandra, and Boris. And while I was listening to Boris, I thought I would sit here and say, no one is innocent, but then, you know, you kind of cheated me, or Hegel cheated us, saying the stone is not innocent. So, you know, my kind of a beginning was a bit ruined, but I think we will definitely talk about that point and some of the contradictions also that the book might contain. But somehow I thought that really, you know, if we think about the book as an object and something, the first thing that you encounter with this book is for sure the cover. And Roxana mentioned already that it's a work by Alexandra, which is called If You Don't Want Us, We Want You. And it's an interesting thing that is it a reaction to a monument, and Alexandra will tell more about that very soon, but also I would like somehow to contextualize this book in this very moment here at MoMA, which is also the exhibition of the Yugoslav architecture. So somehow I think that it might not be a coincidence that those two things are happening at the same time. And it's also the way that the monument and architecture is presenting also in the show is something that I would like to touch today. But Alexandra, in your work, you're referring very often to history. You're referring to monuments and to buildings, and also the first chapter of the book, it is about history, reckoning with history. Maybe if you can tell us more about this project itself, because there is a reason why we choose it for the book, for the cover.
Hi, and thank you for having me first. It's really an honor to be here and to participate also in this discussion. Just to say a couple of words about the project, maybe it's also good to speak a bit about the sculpture. If you don't want us, we want you. The image you see here is basically is representing one of three sculptural additions or public space interventions that deal with sites or public monuments in Bucharest. And only one of those actually belongs to the communist period. So the other two monuments, including this one, have been erected post-89. And this was actually, the project was approved in 2007, and then the sculpture was installed in 2010. But it's basically a reconstruction, in a way, of a previous monument of Carol I. So the question is a sculpture of Carol I, who was the first monarch of Romania. And the original sculpture was taken down by the communists and melted into a Lenin sculpture in 1948. So again, there was like a material manifestation of this ideological change. And actually, in relation to it, I thought there's such a lack of imagination, such a lack of imagining a future or an image that could project a future for the country, that in 2007, so a long time after the Communist Revolution, right, you have to put up this. It wasn't even about leaving a space open for thinking a different image of the future, but it was really replacing or creating an image again of monarchy. So it was really a step back in
Western, yeah.
And of course, this image of the lone individual man, always a male, on a horse, on top of something that he dominates. Yeah, I think this was somehow my interest in relating to this sculpture, not as a legacy of the communist past, but as an image of exactly what Boris was referring to, a transition, this sort of lack of imagination that would produce locally a possible future, let's say, for the.
And also this is a question that I pose also to Sonia Vika in the book, because also the book contains for every chapter also interviews with different artists. Is definitely, and you're an artist she's an artist from more generation of the 60s and 70s, and you are like a contemporary artist, and you were born in the 80s. So it's also like, it's for you the whole notion of Eastern Europe and the communist past. It's a very, in a way, very recent history. But how do you relate to that in your work? Because I'm sure that somehow, even if you don't want to relate, it's impossible to avoid it. And how much is it also sometimes imposed by maybe your commissions or different invitations that you're having?
I mean, even with this project, which is from 2011, and which actually follows a previous work that relates to a public monument in Bucharest, but not one with a historical significance, I think there was also a very strong interest in formal aspects, so in monumentality in terms of relations of scale between the human body and the concept of the public monument and the scale of the public monument, in materiality, so in tensions between, again, the materiality of the human body and stone or bronze. So I think there are also aspects that could be extrapolated to other fields or to other concerns, and also to other regions and to other monuments, or to monumentality as such. And it also, I think this translated also into the project that I made together with Manuel Pelmuș for the Venice Biennial. So again, monumentality in terms of institutional history, or the history of an institution. I don't know. Yeah, it's interesting, because I think, I don't want to speak for a generation, but just talking with artists my age also, from the similar context, from the same context. I don't think, I mean, of course we feel, again, the asymmetries of power and resources, and also of knowledge production, or of infrastructures of knowledge production, but I don't think we feel, or I don't really feel the divide anymore, or at least I don't want to consider it. I feel it, actually. I feel it, but I don't want to consider it. And I think I'm recently also concerned with questions of digital technologies. So again, things that, or topics that can be transnational and that they can relate to global concerns. And I think this, in a way, this is also a sort of decolonizing process where you claim the right to speak about topics that are not locally confined. And so it's not so much about, of course, they also affect me in Romania, but also, another person in Ghana and someone in New York, and questions of algorithmic governance and so on, virtual bodies, museum collections. So, I also think there's nothing to integrate Eastern Europe or Eastern European art into, because I don't think there's a, again, looking at the past from today's perspective, I don't think there's a system that is functional, or a model of the world that we can agree is functional and that we just need to embed this into. So yeah.
And it wouldn't work just embedding it.
Of
anyway.
course, of course.
You mentioned your exhibition at the Venice Biennial, which was actually you with Manuel Pelmuș. You were the artist for the Romanian Pavilion in 2013 at the Venice Biennial, and the exhibition was called an immaterial retrospective of the Venice Biennial, and basically it was with a group of performers. You created a retrospective, like an immaterial retrospective, so the whole history of the Venice Biennial was performed, basically, not only objects, but also events, situations. No, there was
mostly artworks, but some.
Yeah.
Some
and Raluca Volnea, who is also contributing to the book, who is a curator and writer from Bucharest, and who was also Claire's student, a long time ago. Yes, she wrote in her text for the exhibition in 2013 that the choice actually of representing, like, to have an immaterial exhibition, the choice of the performances was an expression of confidence in a future of art which is less fetishist and object-oriented, which contests hegemonic interpretations of history without replacing them with equally hegemonic others, an art which is not beyond and more important than artists or than the people who contribute to its making. So it's also, we just talk about the commodification, the labor, and the whole idea of labor. And I think also the idea that, in which I think it's connecting for what you did here, this idea of representing the National Pavilion through the history of the Venice Biennial itself, and also that was at the time and still a reference to all the immigrants who were working, Romanian, Albanian at the time in Italy. And this like quote in relation to the exhibition, we go slowly through the book to the second chapter, which is dedicated to exhibition, and particularly exhibition about related to Eastern Europe, about Eastern Europe co-exhibiting the East. And Claire wrote an introduction about it, where basically you're giving an overview of the different exhibitions in the West dealing with Eastern Europe, and also mentioning some of the Eastern European institutions who somehow are writing the history themselves. And in the 90s and 2000, there was really this huge wave of Eastern European shows, and I think that Boris and you I know you wrote from some of the catalogs, you participated. It was really a particular phenomena, which I think is very well also summarized in the book. And you, Claire, you started to be interested, let's say, more in Eastern Europe when you were researching your book, Artificial Health. And but particularly in the avant-garde in the 60s and the 70s, and also to mention that in the book we are somehow, even if it's a post-89, this is somehow the date that we are taking as a starting point, we are also, of course, going back and forth with historical avant-gardes, because you cannot not reflect on it. But recently you focused your research more on artists, contemporary artists from, let's say, the region. I love like referring to Eastern Europe as the region. So the artists from the region who were somehow working with modernism, who were like addressing, appropriating, elaborating local modernism. And I think also in the exhibition that I mentioned, the Yugoslav architecture towards a concrete utopia, 1948, 1980, there are a few contemporary artists who are exactly dealing with those subjects, like David Maljkovic with the Vojin Bakic monument, or even Jasmina Cibic with the Gerhard Richter legacy. So what did... Wenceslav Richter, yeah. You see, I'm so westernized.
Our Richter.
Yeah. So what was the result of this, or like what were some of the?
Okay, this is an essay that's unpublished that I've been wrestling with for about 6 years now, because I have no idea how to resolve it. So it's a big unfinished piece of research. It's not really focusing on the region, but it's focusing on contemporary art. It's more of a pan-European project, looking at the way in which contemporary artists are going back to quoting, appropriating, recycling, repurposing modernist architecture and design. And I look at Eastern European art as a foil to Western European artists. This also, I should say, extends to North America and South America as well, because there is as you're probably aware, there's a whole ton of South American artists also dealing with Latin American modernism. That also circulates extensively on the biennial and exhibition circuit, most of which have also trained in Europe. So it's really it's focused on Europe, but spreads out from it. I guess I haven't done. I always feel like a fake on panels about Eastern European art, because I'm really not an authority. I really just tend to go there as a foil to get critical distance on the Western European perspective. But this, I would say, that you can see a number of differences between the Eastern European artists and the Western European artists in terms of how they take up or respond to a legacy of modernism. For the most part, in the West, this is done on the basis of proper names, which are kind of glorified and elevated. So it would be Mies van der Rohe, Corbusier. The great names of modernism are elevated. This is particularly something through the 90s, Bauhaus architects in particular. Through the 2000s, you get more women being incorporated into this. Endless works about Eileen Gray, for example, or these kind of lesser inverted commas figures of modernism, modernist architecture and design. What you find in Eastern Europe is a particular. For some artists, there is the same operation going on as in the West, which is a de-ideologization of modernist architecture. And I would critique David Malkovich as much as I really like looking at his work. He has the final kind of photo mural outside the exhibition upstairs. Because looking at the show of Yugoslav architecture, I realized what an amazing example. I mean, this is the post-war modernism, I think, in terms of uniting an aesthetic vision, tectonic capacity, and social vision, social aspirations. And I was very moved by this exhibition by the end. And to see what David does with this work is to really defunctionalizes it and depurposes it. It's clearly, and this is why it's been a struggle to write this, because I think there's a double and possibly contradictory operation going on with artists who are referring back to modernism. On the one hand, they are drawn to it for its aesthetic and ideological vision. On the other hand, the aesthetic is what always triumphs in the contemporary work of art, and the ideological component is always downplayed, in order to become a celebration of form, a celebration of the proper name, and an ability to circulate as an object in the art market. I would compare that to, say, someone like Paulina Orlowska in Warsaw. No, she's not based in Warsaw, is she? She's in Rabka, who has had a sort of more kind of a repurposing approach to it rather than a defunctionalizing approach. I'm thinking in relationship to the neons that were that adorned and decorated the city of Warsaw through the 60s and 70s. These are neons that, unlike in the West, were not attached to advertising for a particular company, but which instead promoted generic activities like drinking milk or reading or sport. And she went back, she found the archive of the company that had produced these neons through the 60s and 70s, managed to facilitate the Museum of Modern Art in Warsaw to acquire this archive, and then to have these neons rebuilt and reinstalled around the city. And I think that's a different kind of reactivation in public space that's really quite different to the beautiful but ultimately de-ideologizing photo collages of David Malkovich.
Well, I think that, David, and this is maybe, it's not just about him, but maybe actually it's a larger, methodology. It's about also the thinking, what are those monuments today? I think that those monuments are mainly abandoned, they're mainly completely denied because they are related, and particularly talking about former Yugoslavia, the modernism at the time was also hand in hand with the state in a way. So I think
But I'm going to interrupt. These are anti-fascist monuments.
Yes,
and there is nothing of anti-fascism in David Malkovich's work. It's purely in the register of sci-fi utopia. He's like he spins it in the other direction in order not to have to make a decision about it.
I think it's more to because he knows they're anti-fascist, but it's more questioning what do the monuments represent for generations who don't know, So I think it's fact if you ask someone,
Okay, Boris, give us your take.
Yeah. Not focusing on David because, he's not the object.
I haven't seen the exhibition, but I know. You who have seen it probably saw pictures of monuments which no longer exist because they were destroyed systematically by the new, I call it regime, you might call it democracy. By 3,500 anti-fascist monuments in Croatia were destroyed, among them the masterpieces. Not only that, almost 3 million books were also destroyed. 14% of public book found in the public libraries. And probably you have heard this famous phrase, this dilemma, socialism or barbarity. Then, if not earlier in the socialist time, today it makes sense again. So this is what you say. We have to deal with a condition that is hostile to what we celebrate here as a great art, and this is something we don't usually think about the difference between this tradition. I would call it vernacular, national art. This is the mainstream. This is like this is where the money goes of this new democratic state to support this heroes from the past on their horses. This is there, and this is what has won the struggle for democracy. And this is also a challenge for us, how to deal with this reality. Because what we have experienced is how fragile this precious legacy of art is, how it can be removed, destroyed, so that you have only ruins. It is, I don't know whether there are pictures of the ruins of these monuments in the exhibition. There are, okay. But this is something what is for me interesting, and what motivates me to try to really think differently about what is the art we see or hear from the East. It is only one side of it, and this side is endangered. And we must say, I having in mind this special Yugoslav avant-garde, legacy of the Yugoslav avant-garde. And of course, you are right, it was ideological. It was the idea of creating, as Vučićević would say, I'm dreaming about socialist art. It's not a beautiful art or something, especially not Western. It was something new. This, Boris Groys once said that post-communism is a return from future. And probably this applies to this case. But if this return, or these continuities are more continuities with the past, not with the communist past, but with much older past, throughout the communist time, there was this national art, there was this national culture there. And this continuity is interesting. And today, this is the hegemonic cultural form and the social condition in which this culture wins, so to say, historically.
But
well,
Boris, you brought up the innocent question also because, and you put it very eloquently. So I will not, and we have five more minutes. But I wanted just Żmijewski, Artur Żmijewski, the artist Artur Żmijewski, in the interview in the book, he says that in the fall of communism was not the beginning of democracy in Poland, but was the beginning of the fight, what different sides thought it was democracy. And I think there are some, Ksenia just said in her introduction, there is Eastern Europe is a very heterogeneous, and we could also pass the whole evening discuss it, what is Eastern Europe, Central Eastern Europe, Central South Europe, the Balkans, where did it start, So let's call it Eastern Europe for this purpose, but it's very heterogeneous. And the Yugoslav show would be different for another country. And there were, but when we invited you for the seminar, it was clear that there would be some contradictions in the book, and they are mainly related to the idea of the colonial status, the post-colonial status, particularly related to Soviet Union, and to the notion of former East. Because it's clear when you read the book that there are like some writers who, Vid Havranek in his text talks about, post-colonialism, and he talks about, the post-colonialism related to post-communism. There is a lot of writers also that we invited to talk about former East, White, Schollhammer, or even Boris Groys, and yourself, you're against this notion of former East. So if you can just, in those minutes that were left, and maybe we can talk later, elaborate on those like sticky points, let's say, in the book.
Well, sticky points. But let me tell.
That was my euphemism.
Yes. Yeah. As you know, this was a time when, still late, Igor Zabel wrote this. Everybody talks about former East, but nobody talks about former West, which tells everything that one part has survived, or if you like, I would put it that way. This Saint-Just that who does revolution halfway has grave digged out his grave. I think we can think instead, of a failed democratic revolution in the East, rather about the revolution that didn't happen in the West. Also in terms of, facing the new reality and changing according to the new reality. The West hasn't changed. The West simply imposed what it had on including theory. I mean, it is the Western, we use post-colonial theory in terms of a Western theoretical paradigm to describe this particular cultural, local reality, which is in itself problematic, really in terms of what the late Mladen Stilinovic said, an artist who cannot speak English is no artist, meaning that reflection on art, reflection on culture, and even on politics, it has been totally westernized. But the way out is not another, struggle for recognition, creating own art history, cultural history of the East, to oppose the canon of the West, etc. I think it must be connected to some real political changes, and unfortunately these changes are taking place now, but not in the direction we would like to. But so it is not about changing the way, simply changing the way, how we will think about it. It is about doing something, about changing the reality also, not somewhere there, but everywhere.
Which also brings to the chapter which is related to art and activism in the book. And maybe Claire, because you wrote a lot about participation in art, and this is also one of your subjects. And in the book is very much related to different collectives, to different also protests that happen all over. And I know that, from your knowledge of the region and observation, do you see maybe in that direction something that is happening, maybe in terms of the changes that Boris is mentioning?
This is when I'm completely a charlatan. I haven't even been to Eastern Europe for 3 years. I have no idea what's happening there at the moment. I can speak to, the 1960s and 70s, but I can't really tell you what the state of play is at the moment. You have people here. Don't ask me. I live down the road. These people live in Eastern Europe.
Alexandra, what do you think?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think it's sometimes difficult to separate the concrete from the symbolic, or to see if maybe they don't operate together. Yeah, I'm not sure how to. Yeah.
Well, maybe we can do it in the Q&A and find the right question for Claire. Thank you.
Well, I'll start while we're waiting for this to come up by thanking the editors and the organizers, but also feeling a bit like somewhat of a charlatan, or maybe not, because we've kind of slipped in through the back door, since Eastern Europe is really only a third of our regions, let's say, along with Central Asia and the Caucasus. Now, when we named ourselves Slavs and Tatars, it was a very different time, as we've all mentioned, 10, 12 years ago. All these Eastern European nations were being sort of cowered into repeating or modeling themselves after the Western liberal democracy. There was a kind of ineffable march westwards. The world has changed dramatically since then. But we deliberately chose for the name Slavs and Tatars, in a sense, to Boris's point, to not be taken seriously. Because when you think of sort of Slavs and Tatars, in the West, people conjure up ideas of a little bit like Braveheart, a kind of a horde of people coming from the horizon to rape and pillage. And that was a time when people were afraid of the Polish plumber and the Bulgarian builder. And we have different fears today, unfortunately. I wish we had those concerns. Now, when we look towards history, we talk often about this idea of resuscitating history. And resuscitating is a very specific term because it's an affective approach to the historical matter. So it's really putting your lips onto the lips of history and breathing in and out. It's not romantic, so it's not a French kiss. When you're doing CPR, the person didn't ask you for tongue or lips action. It's really an urgency question. But also there's this question of resuscitation, which has that respect, meaning that it's really important to disrespect your sources, but to disrespect your historical source, you have to respect it, and vice versa. To respect the source, you have to disrespect it. And this is something that, if there's a different way to describe our region, another way to describe our region is through the iconographies or the legends, which is why we pushed our region eastwards towards the former Berlin Wall. There's a great article recently about this by Jacob, I think he's American, Makinovsky, in the LA Review of Books, where he talks about the fact that there is no Eastern Europe without Islam. We of course think about Eastern Europe in terms of Christianity and Judaism, but Islam has played an equally important role in defining Eastern Europe. An example of this is this figure here, Mullah Nasruddin. He's a kind of comic wise man / fool. He's the equivalent in, basically there's an example of him everywhere there were significant Muslim populations. So everywhere from the Balkans, Croatia essentially, eastwards to China, downwards to Somalia and Sudan. And he goes under different names, Afanti in China, Hoja in Arabic countries, Joha in Arabic countries, Hoja in Turkic countries, Mullah Nasruddin. But he's the equivalent, I guess, if we have to use Western examples, of the Brothers Grimm or La Fontaine's fables. Adults tell children stories about Nasruddin in a way to impart questions of perspective, ethics, and there's even a whole body of dirty Nasruddin literature that has been sadly expunged from the archive. But this Nasruddin is, in some sense, he's also the kind of the proto-Ali G or Borat, right? He asks very stupid questions to smart subject matter. And I think it's very important to, that's what I mean by disrespecting, is you have to ask those stupid questions to, otherwise, you have to be the fool in some sense in times like these when reality is far more foolish than the foolish could ever be. So a typical Nasruddin story is, you know, somebody's on one side of the river and he yells to Mullah Nasruddin, how do I get to the other side of the river? And Nasruddin says, you are on the other side of the river. So like through this very, very first degree humor, there's quite complex questions being posed. So these are just some of the examples of Nasruddin Hoja you find. He's been kind of commercialized in Turkey and all over our region. So he's a bit of a retroactive mascot for Slavs and Tatars. And also he's often depicted riding backwards on his donkey. And I think this is very important for today's discussion and panel and Boris's. I'm thrilled to be following Boris's opening remarks because this question of amnesia, I mean, Nasruddin is always facing backwards on his donkey. And that's another story, of course. They ask Nasruddin Hoja, why are you always backwards on your donkey? And he says, well, there's no point in both of us looking in the same direction. But we try to find a more intellectual reason for this, which is that there's this question of anti-modernism that Antoine Compagnon, who used to teach at Columbia, I think he still does, at the Collège de France as well, he wrote a book called Les Anti-Modernes, which hasn't been translated into English for some reason. It's been translated into Spanish. And sorry, this is the book. And he traces an anti-modern position in French literature, 19th century French literature, so Péguy, Chateaubriand, all the way to the 20th century, with Baudelaire, with Barthes. And he says that the true modernists are not the Mayakovskis and the Marinettis who believe in sort of gung-ho, future will deliver us from everything, technology will sort of industrialization, speed, etc. He says the true modernists are those modernists who have a conflictual relationship with the passing of the pre-modern era. So if we remember how Sartre describes Baudelaire, driving into the future with an eye on the rearview mirror, or Benjamin's Angel of History, of course. But all the languages that we're familiar with, sadly, are Indo-European, and those languages spatially conceive of time very in a positivist sense. So whether you're in Russian or in Polish or in Persian, we think of the future as ahead of us because we imagine we know where we're going, and we think of the past as behind us because that implies that it's irrelevant. And in Malgache, actually, which is an excellent book on Malgache ethnography, which actually in Malgache, the future is described spatially as behind you, and the past is in front of you. So it's in some sense a more accurate conception of time, progress, and history. So another way to describe this kind of, I guess, our region is something we call the metaphysical splits. So not the splits of the legs, but the splits of the mind, meaning how do we bring together two conflicting, two antithetical, two mutually exclusive ideas, voices, registers into one voice, one register, one space. And in English, again, the terms, most of them are not even English. They're usually Latin, I guess, like amphibole. An important one, an interesting one is coincidentia oppositorum, which is actually a Catholic Christian idea that to convey the transcendent, you have to use irrational language or the language of paradox. And for us, this region, we've talked about sort of communism and socialism, but this region is really, we take sort of Stalin's motto and revert it. So instead of, Stalin said to Central Asian Muslims and Caucasus Muslims, he said, not Moscow, sorry, not Mecca, but Moscow. To Moscow, we should be praying, not to Mecca. And we believe that we shouldn't be choosing between either of those two geopolitical narratives. So in some sense, today, we're living in a time when, and our region is really caught between these two walls, right? These walls that normally you don't put together, the Great Wall of China, the former Berlin Wall, but also very few people put Marx and Muhammad in the same space, which we should be doing more often, not because we want Molotov cocktails thrown through our windows, but because today, and we've been thinking about this for over a decade, but it's great to see more important thinkers about this get to prominence, like people like Olivier Roy in France, sadly following the attacks in Paris. Roy has been saying from the beginning that it's not about the radicalization of Islam that's a problem, but it's the Islamicization of radicalism. So our wall is really between these two figures of Marx and Muhammad. And people like even Norman Brown is another interesting figure, whom some of you might be familiar with, who was a professor of comparative literature in Santa Cruz. He was famous for writing A Love's Body, where he psychoanalyzed the whole of history. And Norman Brown spent the last 10 years of his life reading the Quran, not because he was a convert to Islam. He remained, I think, a Methodist his whole life, but because he believed that the true modernist text was actually the Quran, that in fact, until James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake arrived, we in the West couldn't understand the Quran because we didn't understand its temporal structure. We didn't have the tools to understand that the Quran, unlike the New and Old Testament, is not linear, it's not teleological, and characters morph into other characters. So you turn a page, and Hagar is Joseph, the next page Joseph is Muhammad, the next page Muhammad is Jesus. And he goes on to identify 110 of the surahs, the chapter headings of the Quran, in Finnegan's Wake. But also he has this great quote, Norman Brown, where he says he calls Marxism and Islam two tired old forces, two tired revolutionary horses, but that we should not take any comfort from their failure because both Marxism and Islam agree that there shall be one world or there shall be none. And in some sense, it's really the legacy, in fact, the universalization that we should be doing of Eastern Europe is what we try to do also, is that what lessons can we today, if we're battling this idea of political Islam, because political Islam has become the successor ideology to communism, right? Iran has replaced the Soviet Union for obvious reasons over the past 40 years as the enemy of the West. The only ideology, viable ideology, sadly, after the fall of communism, was the Iranian regime's ideology, which of course we don't agree with and even in any way espouse, but it was the only ideology contrary to triumphant, let's say, Western neoliberal capitalism on a global scale. I mean, Chavez and the rest, there was no ideology associated with that, at least an actual ideology. Now, this brings us to, the first time we started to think about these things is also, how do we think about these ideological questions in not a stupid manner, but in a kind of through affective means. And part of that is through philology, not just ideology, but philology. And we did that here in the MoMA 6 years ago when we were invited for a projects show where we, we thought that, in fact, Slavs and Tatars was founded as a questioning of this idea of modernity, this Western idea of modernity. So we can't just do a show about a specific subject matter like we normally do about medieval advice literature, for example, but we decided to look at the question of language through its affective tools, so through its other organs. We always talk about language through the tongue, but what about the language through the throat? What about the language through the nose? These kind of other organs of erogenous activity, because all the organs of language are actually quite sensuous, if you think about it. The throat, the lips, the nose, the ears. And we decided to look at this, even this sort of kitab kebab is a book kebab, is how can we, in some sense, approach knowledge production not through the Enlightenment legacy. And today is only, I think, 2 days after the 15th anniversary of Edward Said's death. And it's important to talk about that in this context because, as we've touched upon tonight, Eastern Europe was conceived. Eastern Europe was the first other. It was the first East, right? It was really during the Enlightenment when we created these ideas of the Slav or the kind of the barbaric other in Europe. And sadly, Said's thought has only recently and only partially been integrated in Eastern European circles. For example, Russia has a big debate whether Said is relevant to the Soviet context. Was the USSR a colonial power? Was it an empire? Well, the answer is yes and no. We have an entire lecture performance that we've dedicated to this, that we did at the Guggenheim last year, but it's yes and no. And the Russians have a great term for this, and the Germans too. We just say "danyet," or the Germans, I think you have "yain," right? So it's the question is yes and no. And so we decided to, one of the books we published is actually called all about the sound ch, and how we can look at ch as a kind of approach to language in 3 different alphabets as a kind of an effective approach to language, or a metaphysical approach to language, not language as transaction, but language as another form of hermeneutics, let's say. And the throat is really an interesting, I mean, ch is, unlike most sounds, which are pronounced by pushing air through your vocal tract, ch is about the closing of that tract, right? So it's about blocking air. I mean, I used to think that ch was also, I kind of had a love affair with ch, where I thought it was like the anti-colonialist phoneme, because Americans and English can't pronounce it. But actually it doesn't work, because the Dutch have a lot of ch, and they're very guilty, and they're definitely not innocent. And this ch, of course, when we decided to look at this ch, it's also this question of alphabets not being innocent. Alphabets, we think alphabets are just happen to convey certain sort of graphemes, happen to convey certain phonemes, but the Arabic alphabet arose with Islam, of course. The Latin alphabet has been both sort of accompanied the rise of Christianity in the early centuries, but also a secularization. The Latin alphabet has become a kind of global secular alphabet, and which is why the Soviets, in fact, flirted with Latinizing Russian, even in the early 20s, because this idea that Latin was a proletariat, common, secular script. And of course, Cyrillic with the rise of Orthodox Christianity, but then several centuries later, with the Bolshevik revolution and sort of the imperialism of communism in the 20th century. And so Khlebnikov, who was, if you're familiar with Khlebnikov, he's a Russian futurist. He's kind of like the emo equivalent to Mayakovsky. Mayakovsky is like the jock of futurism, really good looking and sort of buff. And Khlebnikov was always in the corner, kind of droopy and a bit sad, and much more looking east as well. He was looking towards defining Russia's intellectual trajectory, not by looking west, like Peter the Great has done and Russians have often done since, but looking east towards Russia's Turkic, Persian, Mongol roots in some sense. And he gave an agency to letters. So he didn't believe in this Saussurian idea of structural linguistics. He thought that alphabets actually, letters have an agency vis-a-vis the other letters that follow them. So if you take a word like chlam, which means junk, and you just change the L to an R, it becomes chram, and it's kind of sublimated the question of the use of this. And inside the exhibition, there were 3 chs dancing around a kind of a pool of blood. In some sense, really, the pool of blood or the pool of red is another example of this kind of metaphysical splits, because through the simple gesture of red, in Iran, for example, red is used as a kind of really the most political manipulation of violence, as a kind of the martyr's blood in fountains around the cities. But when children would come into the exhibition, they would run towards it as a kind of festive, the idea of red is simply very innocent. And parents would sort of grab them and say, no, don't go towards the red. So there's this push and pull of the red amongst them. Now, we first became interested in this question of alphabet politics when we translated Molla Nasruddin, which is a very important, probably the most important political, the most important periodical of the 20th century Muslim world. And the inevitable question is, why do we as artists have to translate the most important periodical of the Muslim world of the 20th century? Meaning, if we are to believe the nonsense which passes as wisdom, that Islam is, or political Islam is the kind of the major challenge of our time, how come this wasn't translated in the 50s and the 60s and 70s? Why? Well, the answer is not because we're great archivists or researchers. It's simply that people don't go to our region. Our region is really an in-between region. The Caucasus, Central Asia especially, I mean, even Eastern Europe. It's a liminal region of Europe. And Central Asia and the Caucasus, these are regions that have lived between empires, but they don't really fit into neatly. For example, it's largely Muslim, Central Asia and the Caucasus, but it's not the Middle East. It's largely Russian-speaking today, but it's not Russia. And this, let's say, this margins of ideologies, these frontiers of rituals, is really where the most interesting things happen. It's not in the centers of power, at least in my opinion, that where the most interesting things are happening. It's not in Moscow and Washington or in Paris, but it's really at the edges where the kind of syncretism happens, where Islam is in touch with Buddhism and Hinduism, where languages are really in touch with other languages and other alphabets that affect them. And they really syncretism becomes a kind of open source code, incorporating elements of previous, or kind of temporal elements, previous temporal realities, as well as spatial realities. Now, Mullah Nasruddin was a satirical periodical, and it was read from India all the way to Morocco, but it was published in Baku. I mean, another reason why nobody really had translated this is because sadly nobody goes to Baku. If they go, they're going for sort of oil contracts for Eurovision song contests, but not for any reasons more substantial than that. And you can see, great, very progressive, very much for women's rights. This is a Azeri man with his Azeri wife, and the same man with his Russian lover. So showing this kind of double standard vis-a-vis Christian women and Muslim women. And Azerbaijan, again, upends that assumption that we have that Muslim countries are necessarily somehow more oppressive of women than Christian countries, because Azerbaijan gave women the right to vote before, I think, any single European nation, definitely before the United States in 1917. And the most important thing it did, of course, was its work on language, because Azeri wasn't considered a real, let's say, a discursive language in the 20th century. It was considered to be a dialect. If you published, you would publish in Istanbul Turkish, official Turkish, or Russian. And so there's a whole body of caricatures on the role of language imposition, like a Duma member, members, the Russian parliament, stitching another tongue into an Azeri man's mouth. And the craziest thing, of course, is that the fact that the alphabet's changed 3 times in 100 years. Now we know about Turkey probably changing, right? Latinization of the Turkish alphabet, but 3 times is absolutely mind-boggling. What it does, first of all, it destroys your intellectual heritage, for starters, because what happens is, sort of Trotsky and Lenin believed in this idea that the revolution of the East is the Latinization of the Muslim subjects of the Russian Empire. That you would cut them off from Arabic and from Islam and sort of push them into modernity. So in 29, all the books out, start reading from left to right, same language. So the languages are all Turkic, whether it's Azeri, Uzbek, Kyrgyz, Dagestani. 90% of Russians and Muslims are Turkic speakers. But they keep the alphabet, they keep the language, they just change the alphabet. And then in 39, Stalin is, of course, paranoid about pan-Turkism. In the interim time, Ataturk has also changed the alphabet so that they wouldn't be mutually intelligible, these nations. He changes it to Cyrillic, and then in 91, and still now, some of them are returning back to Latin. So you have this phenomenon where 3 generations can speak the same language. So a grandmother, a son, and a granddaughter can all speak the same language, but can't read the same book. So you become immigrants within your own language, which is a very peculiar phenomenon. Now, Paul Ricoeur talks about language translation as a form of linguistic hospitality, right? That you're inviting the foreigner into your language and you're expropriating yourself into the language of the foreigner. If that's the case, then in some sense, transliteration, which is the change of scripts within a language, is a kind of transvestism of alphabets. It's taking the alphabet of the other and imposing it on oneself or wearing it oneself. A good example of this is, of course, most people here understand this. And when you present this in Europe, you have to contextualize what sort of frat boy humor is. Sadly, that we're learning a lot about, or hearing a lot about in the recent, in the current Supreme Court confirmation process. But this question of to be or not to be, which is really a vulgarization of an important existential question, right? To be or not to be. There's another version which is 2 beers or not 2 beers. They're both equally stupid, but the question for us becomes, how can we recuperate the gravitas of that original question, right? Because if Anna drinks a beer or doesn't drink a beer, I don't care. It's a question of consumption and preference. Go ahead, drink a beer. But if you write to beer or not to beer in Arabic, literally transcribing it in Arabic, it becomes a question of being again, because it's a question of being Muslim or not being Muslim. It's a question of belonging to a community or not belonging to a community, because for a Muslim to drink a beer or not drink a beer is not simply a question of consumption. So there's a kind of an attempt to elevate that which is quite base. And so the follow-up book to I should say was a book about the nose and nasals, because in Slavic languages, very few Slavic languages have nasal sounds. And the nose becomes another site of resistance to the kind of hegemony of the tongue that we see. In Polish, for example, when they tried to, when there were attempts in the late 19th century to Cyrillicize Polish by the Russians, and the speed bumps they hit were these two sort of nifty vowels in Polish that I'm sure you can pronounce better than me, Anna. It's ow and ow, ow. Nasals, essentially. Russian doesn't have any nasal sounds, so they had to create these. They had to actually conceive of alphabets or letters to accommodate these sounds that don't exist. Now, the most famous example of language script change is Ataturk, right? And there's a professor called Ilker Ayturk who calls Ataturk the great Romanizer, and I love this way he talks about it because it's actually called Romanization. That's the official term, not Latinization. But Romanizer also sounds like womanizer, and Ataturk, with his sort of blue eyes and his sort of misogyny, was definitely a womanizer. So it sort of brings him back to that, his more sort of down-to-earth, sort of less godlike status that sadly has led us to where Turkey is today, even. But when of course, when he Latinized the alphabet, it was not just an ideological question of hitching your alphabet onto the alphabet of another culture, right? Of course, there was this inferiority complex towards the West, but there were legitimate reasons to do so. Now, all these are the Turkic languages across the world, and what's interesting about Turkey is it's probably the only country in the old world, meaning Europe, Asia, let's say, whose language doesn't come from the land where it is. Its language comes as really, really far away from the east, basically from sort of current-day China, sort of southeast Russia. Now, the only Turkic language in the world still written in Arabic is, ironically enough, in China and in Xinjiang, where by the Uyghurs. Now, when Ataturk changed, the reason he changed as well was because Turkish has 9 vowels, and the Arabic alphabet only had 3. So how could you accommodate these and the ü, these kind of German-looking vowels, the umlauts, that Turkish has, but that no Arabic script really could accommodate? So he Latinized the alphabet. But when you Latinize, you lose sounds as well. And this is something we forget about in the same way that the amnesia of political ideologies is the amnesia of sort of philological transitions, is that the Turks had 2 N's as well. They had a normal N, which is pronounced like never, niyahat, and then they had another N, which is pronounced like So try pronouncing For me, it sounds not only like you're flirting with somebody, but it also sounds like, it sounds really like a gong style, like an Asian sound. And I'm not just saying that because I'm an Orientalist, but because if you go to Wiki, you can find an entry that says people in China with the first name NG. It's a very common sound in Mandarin. If you go to a Chinese restaurant, you can order choy, the water spinach, and this it's not a coincidence that Ataturk dropped this sound, because it really sort of brings Turkish back to its Asian origins, right? If Turkey's trying to be desperately Western, then this is a really inconvenient kind of reminder of who Turks are or were. So the further east you go in the Turkic regions, Turkic language regions, from Turkey all the way to, let's say, Kyrgyzstan or Uzbekistan, they still have this It's still further back in the throat in some sense. And the more west you go, the more it is towards the sort of the mouth of the language. Now I'll end with a quote by Marshall McLuhan on the topic, where he talks about the Greek myth about the alphabet was that Cadmus, reputedly the king who introduced the phonetic letters into Greece, sowed the dragon's teeth, and they sprang up as armed men. Languages are filled with testimony to the grasping, devouring power and precision of teeth. That the power of letters as agents of aggressive order and precision should be expressed as extensions of the dragon's teeth is natural and fitting. Letters are not only like teeth visually, but their power to put teeth into the business of empire building is manifest in our Western history. Thank you very much.
I think we should bring, actually, I would like to invite you back on the chairs.
Yes, we have a Q&A from the top.
So we have about 20 minutes for questions. Anna, you want to give maybe one in the middle for any of the panelists or the editors of the book?
I have a question for Claire.
I'm sure you have a number of questions.
No, but just because I think we are in the museum, and you know, it's interesting to think about exhibitions, and you know, just to bring us again to the context. We mentioned the Yugoslav exhibition several times, and I would like Claire to just like summarize a bit her chapter, and you know, because I think in this way we can also go go a bit in the also Central Asian region that Paya mentioned. And I think it's a good way also to opening, you know, to like grounded us here in the museum.
Yeah, so this is something I've actually researched rather than something I'm just making up on the spot. So I try to read these kind of the history of exhibitions of art about Eastern Europe from the time of the transition forward, focusing mainly on what the West, meaning North America and Western Europe, have made of it. And you notice really clear ideological changes in accordance with different geopolitical dynamics. So the first phase of American exhibitions about Eastern European art in the 90s is really in the register of curatorial safari. The curators go hunting for the new fare that can be found on the other side of the newly opened border. And there's something you notice in catalogues of this time is there's always a timeline, there's always a map, because where is this place? None of it, you know, it was a dark foreign land until recently. And it's really, you just get a smattering of a bit of everything, apart from work from actually former Yugoslavia, because the Balkan Wars makes it impossible for curators to go and, they don't feel safe going to research there. Then this starts to shift into Central and Eastern Europe, yeah? So it becomes Central and Eastern Europe. It's not just Eastern Europe, there's a little bit more specificity in it. And this is largely found in exhibitions made in Austria and Germany as a kind of nostalgic recovery of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And part of the thrust of these shows from the 90s is really to deal with the legacy of Yalta, so that Eastern Europe is presented as the lost half of the history of Western European art. It's an integrationist approach. You then, like turning the millennium, you start to get a focus then on the Balkans. And this emphasis on Eastern European art becomes totally rebranded as Balkan art. And in the wake of the Yugoslav wars. And then what you start to find then through the 2000s, with the expansion of the EU, is a focus then on the new Europe. So at each point, what I'm trying to draw out for you is this kind of rebranding of Eastern Europe, from Eastern Europe to Eastern and Central Europe to the Balkans, through to the new Europe, which would include all the kind of the new arrivals. That's actually a name of an exhibition, new arrivals, to the EU. And then you start to get, and of course, the new arrivals, it means that we start to edge towards the furthest reaches of Europe, and it's starting to reach its non-Christian limits. And this then, I think, becomes the kind of the next phase of these exhibitions, which is, in recent years, actually, there are a couple of exhibitions from last year, are really dealing with the effect of immigration and the Syrian diaspora as it arrives and confronts Eastern Europe ethnic purity, with exhibition titles like Attention, Border, this was in Bialystok, or Fear of the Unknown in Bratislava and Prague. So that's my summary of where it heads, because I think you can really trace through exhibition titles and the way in which they're framed this the kind of changing geopolitical concerns in that region.
And here we are now.
And here we are now, which
New
brings us... Oh, sorry, I missed out the Central Asia episode. That was the one. Sorry, this kind of... from between the expansion of the EU, we have the interest in Central Asia. And so the shift is from, rather than the integrationist approach of the 1990s, the 2000s are much more about, actually, if we look further east, we can realign ourselves. It's not about aligning our narrative with Western Europe, but instead seeing what are the common conditions, what are the similarities with Russia, with Central Asia, and looking further east.
And
I would like to ask if that is reflected in how you've been incorporated into exhibitions. Well, both of you are a bit too young for
But yeah, I mean, that's why I feel like we're quite lucky to be here tonight, because I feel like we just got through the back door. I mean, as part of the Eastern, partly Eastern European or Slavic. what's important also is to recognize is that all these geographies are equally imagined as they are political, right? And that, I mean, I have no authority to speak about. I'm not a Slav and I'm not a Tatar, so what authority do I have to speak about this region? But I think that's what's is interesting is when you're dedicating yourself to things that you're not necessarily familiar with or in agreement with, meaning that I have a certain interest in, let's say, Russian studies or Slavic languages, but they're not my languages. And it's actually, and again, it's a challenge to the kind of Enlightenment idea that critique has to happen through objective distance. In fact, if you look at other traditions, whether they're even Jewish traditions or Muslim traditions of scholarship, there's this idea also of critique being a kind of an intimate experience or an affective experience. So this idea that expatriation, when you're furthest away from yourself, that's when you understand yourself. It's it's actually by kind of a projecting outside. But for us, what's I guess more interesting is how we can reveal the East within the West. So there's a very famous Russian proverb, sort of scratch a Russian, reveal a Tatar, and even Germany is a Western nation, right? Boris touched upon this idea that Germany has branded itself a Western nation quite successfully, right? That it's this Enlightenment country, analytical, efficient, et cetera, but actually Germany's history is equally a history of Eastern Europe, of non-rationalism, whether it's Romanticism, whether it's Theosophy, whether it's even its geographical sort of borders, in fact, were equally Eastern European as they were Western European. And sadly, that's been brushed under the carpet, that somehow Germany has sort of put that beside, discarded that. And with that has been the question of philology. Even philology is an Eastern concept. You don't have departments of philology in the West anymore. You have linguistics. Philology is considered to be tainted, Eastern, kind of backwards. Why would you study language through religion and literature when you can study language through where you put your tongue on your roof of your mouth? You know? So.
Shall we open to the public? There was one there.
Hi, thank you. I'm going to speak from a more academic perspective because I feel like we've talked. Everyone's turning around. This is always so. So this is a great tool for people who are graduate students and are interested in this subject. And I'm looking at Ksenia now because she just got her PhD a few days ago. So I'm wondering, because this is still a field that within art history is largely understudied, and MoMA is kind of at the forefront of pushing Eastern Europe as an academic discipline within art history. And so I'm wondering, last year we had a conference at the Graduate Center, and Claire was there, and this question came up of how do you expand this study of modern European art into the Eastern and Central European context. And I wonder, I don't know who I want to ask this question, but this is kind of a general question of what your thoughts are. And something that we've come up with last year was that this idea that Europeanists, or people who are trained in European canon, should kind of progressively expand their interests into Eastern and Central Europe. Of course, this necessitates knowing the languages, so it's a little more complicated than that. So I wonder if you guys have any thoughts on that, given this is an academic resource.
Can you hear me? Okay, great. Well, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much for that question, Patrick. I'll recall the first primary documents book, which was published in 2002 and edited by Laura Hauptmann and Thomas Popischbil. I used that book as an undergraduate. It was literally the only book I had, and it was the book constantly recommended to me. So needless to say, it's, here we are so many years later producing the newest primary documents book, and let's say a second volume, a continuation of that conversation. And I think what speaks most strongly in this volume is the note on which we end, which is this idea of the global that's put out there as a polemic and a contradiction and a question of whether or not it we can discuss Eastern Europe within that framework or not, and if that framework even exists to begin with, what is the global? And that's in fact where Slavs and Tatars comes into the conversation, and many other interesting texts that broaden what we might define as quote unquote Central and Eastern Europe. So I don't think I have an answer for you, just probably more confusion by incorporating this idea of what global art or world art can mean in the context of Eastern Europe.
May I say a few words, because I was actually talking also about this weird connection with between the idea of a geographical region, area, geopolitical, and also in terms of a normative identity block, like the West or East. It's quite a normative concept. And area of knowledge in terms of disciplinary production of knowledge. The problem is that these divisions have always social consequences, so that they generate what we can call a certain different types of subjectification, so that there is, to repeat it, there is no innocent division, neither in terms of disciplinary division of knowledge, nor in terms of division into different regions and areas. And I would support the idea of Rancière of indisciplinarity, so of breaking this still typical and very strong way of thinking in terms of both areas of knowledge production and the regions, and to search spaces and temporalities beyond these divisions, because it's always, and I don't have to remind you, speaking in these academic and disciplinary terms, of the idea that anthropology always looks into its objects of knowledge as being in a different time, in a different temporality than the subject of knowledge. So it's about temporalities, belatedness, etc. About so the point is to try to think beyond these divisions, which is quite a challenge.
Good evening. I would actually like to follow on to your comments right now. As somebody who works, lives, and is identified as an African artist, the expansion of Africa is constantly, no matter where around the world you are. Whereas when we look at European artists or European art, is it produced by somebody who's living within the continent, as opposed to you could be a European in the diaspora. So you can be a European in Africa painting, and it won't be considered European art, it's considered African art because you are geographically on the African continent. So in this movement of looking at how art is classified, and as you venture towards the global, where does the global stop when we start looking at geographies, especially when we consider that linguistically we have these exoticizations that must happen because of where you are or where your heritage is?
Is this to me?
Oh, it's for anyone on the panel, but you just happen to have triggered it.
About globalization.
I mean, I can tell you that for us, it wasn't so much, in fact, at some point it wasn't so much about geography. It wasn't about Central and Eastern Europe as a geographical region as much as it was a kind of a discursive tool that we used in order to, on one hand, as I mentioned in the introduction and as others have mentioned in their presentations, it was more of a way in which we would redefine a certain marginalization and contest a certain marginalization of Central and Eastern Europe, the way that that region has been historicized. And yeah, I would think that that's primarily where we were going, not so much in terms, because truly, I think that the main problem was a kind of homogenization also of that region. It was the big gray area of those countries behind the Iron Curtain during a particular period of time. And if you think about it, what this kind of new collectivity was kind of fighting against was precisely against this type of homogenization. So yeah, that's what I would say. Yeah, Alexandra.
I just wanted to bring in, there's a nice Dan Perzhovsky drawing / writing. He's also a Romanian artist. He had a show at the MoMA, I think, that says, I'm not exotic, I'm exhausted.
Yeah.
So yeah, maybe that is somehow useful for this. I also think the concept of horizontal territory in terms of defining space is not that helpful today because of, again, vertical geographies of digital spaces. So things get more complicated. And you were also speaking about the crisis of the Westphalian systems of understanding the world in terms of geographically defined spaces and nation states. But at the same time, I think that within the Anthropocene, let's say, there is a certain disenchantment also, or that circulates as an affect or as a feeling with a Western modernity, or the way the West has defined modernity and again emancipation or progress. So for sure, I think that looking into these other geographical spaces and histories and legacies and traditions, it could be. I mean, it's still worth to have these distinctions, or it's still worth to tap into these other pools of knowledge also, and culture, let's say, or cultural mixture.
It's interesting that I think it was Georg Schollhammer, the Austrian critic, who said, said it's writing that Eastern Europe, it's an operational tool, that you kind of need to use it to define yourself, which from an Eastern European coming from an Austrian, it also can be problematic, and we can discuss it, why we would need an operational tool or an operational term to define. But it's also something that, in a way we embrace it with no innocence, to repeat Boris, the fact that there was this group, the CMAP Eastern European, so it was our way of embrace it, but also question it, deconstruct it, go into a certain line. I think that still the positions are pretty clear. I mean, I think also the choice, of speakers and, of certain text, we have a position, but it was also to somehow embrace all the contradictions and the tensions that are happening around the term, around the region, because I think exactly those tensions are the most interesting part, and that's the same if you think in terms of canons, if you think of an exhibition, if you think in terms of the collection. How do you present those things can be actually extremely interesting because of those tensions.
I have a micro footnote that takes it in a different direction, because your point makes me think back to Patrick's point about the academy, which is now slowly percolated through to a point for me, which is that in terms of I think when you're looking at the advisors for this book, it's amazing how few of them come from American universities, how little space there is for the study of Eastern European art in American academia, and I think in the eyes of American academia, it's like you think of a Venn diagram with the global on one side and Eastern European on the other. The intersection is actually a gap. It's an aporia. And I have students who've done Eastern European art and they apply for jobs branded as global and they don't get them. So it's, we're in. It's a.
I hear you.
Yeah, it's not. There we go. You're doing something other to the Western tradition, but not other enough to be interesting.
Not different, but not different enough. Exotic, but not exotic enough. But I think we have time for one more question, or two more questions.
be efficient.
I have a question to Baris, but maybe whoever else wants to comment as well. Speaking about all this mental geographies, have you heard about this concept of the New East, and what do you think about it? And for those who don't know, there is a Calvert journal. There is a journal that's called Calvert Journal, published by Calvert Foundation, based in London, but it's actually a Russian, financed by Russian money. And so this is the publication that heavily promotes the concept of the New East. I don't know, have you heard about it?
Let me say it openly. I know nothing about it.
Okay.
But I wouldn't even be so much interested because this combination of something relatively old, which is the East, and the new, it's just another wave of, I'm afraid, of commodification, which could be also of a commodification of a labor of native informants. You know what I mean, the Spivak's concept. And this is about exhaustion of a commodified labor of native informants, providing constantly raw material for the hegemonic theory production. And this is also a mode of survival for both Old and New East. And so I think there is a time for some sort of radical critique, but this critique obviously won't come this time by clever minds, but it will be the critique of the reality itself, which has been changing, our perceptions and turning around what we have learned in this how many years after the fall of communism. So what used to be East I always say, the former Yugoslavia and this tragic collapse, the war, and what happened with the destruction, including with barbarity, etc., etc. This was, a symptom coming from the future, of an illness, and now spreading around. So what is past? What is present? What is the future? This is quite open, quite an open issue.
It's interesting because Evgeny Fix, the artist who is here, when we were gathering here, he said, "Who knows what will be on this book? Who knows what will be your third tome about the Eastern Europe?" So I think that would be a great way to finish. We would have a moment. What do you think? Shall we take one more?
What I want to say is that actually we should go in the garden. That's where we're going to go, because you are all invited and you can ask more questions, but on a more one-to-one, private, over a drink. Thank you all for coming.